Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Detective Ray Morrison had built his life on three pillars: duty, family, and trust. For 15 years, he'd served the Denver Police Department with distinction, specializing in organized crime and domestic violence cases. His methodical approach and ability to read people had earned him respect among colleagues and fear among criminals. But it was his family that truly defined him. His wife, Linda, a kindergarten teacher with gentle eyes and a warm smile, their teenage son, Kyle, and 5-year-old daughter, Emma. Ray had met Linda during his rookie year when she was a witness in a domestic abuse case. Her compassion for the victim and quiet strength had drawn him in. They married 2 years later, and Ray believed he'd found his anchor in a world full of darkness. Linda seemed to understand the weight he carried from his cases, offering comfort without judgment. Kyle had inherited his father's analytical mind, but combined it with his mother's empathy. At 17, he was already talking about following his father into law enforcement, though Ray secretly hoped his son would choose a different path. Emma was pure joy, a bright, curious girl who saw the world through innocent eyes. Their neighbor, Troy Hansen, had moved in 3 years ago after his divorce. A successful real estate developer in his early 40s, Troy was charming, athletic, and had quickly become part of their social circle. He coached Kyle's baseball team, joined their weekend barbecues, and seemed to genuinely care about the family. Ray had even considered him a close friend. What Ray didn't know was that Linda had been feeling increasingly isolated in their marriage. Ray's work often consumed him, leaving him emotionally distant even when physically present. The stories he brought home, the darkness he witnessed daily, had created an invisible wall between them. She tried to bridge that gap, but found herself drawing closer to Troy's easy warmth and attention. The affair had started 6 months ago during one of Ray's extended investigations into a human trafficking ring. Linda and Troy's friendship had gradually shifted into something more, built on stolen moments and the dangerous thrill of secrecy. They convinced themselves that Ray's emotional unavailability justified their betrayal, but both knew they were playing with fire. Kyle had begun noticing subtle changes in his mother's behavior. The way she checked her phone constantly, her sudden interest in working out, the new clothes she claimed were for school events. His detective instincts, inherited from his father, started piecing together a disturbing picture. On this particular evening, Ray had finally closed the trafficking case, bringing home a rare victory. The family had celebrated with dinner at Emma's favorite restaurant, and for once, everything felt normal. Linda had been especially affectionate, perhaps driven by guilt, while Troy had texted congratulations about the case closure, a detail that would later prove significant. As they settled into bed, Ray felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in months. His family was safe, his latest case was solved, and tomorrow promised to be a fresh start. He had no idea that his son was downstairs, having returned early from a friend's house, about to discover something that would shatter their world forever. The foundation of Ray Morrison's carefully constructed life was about to crumble, and the man who had spent his career hunting predators was about to discover that the greatest threat to his family had been living right next door, welcomed into their home with open arms. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. Kyle Morrison had always prided himself on being observant, a trait that served him well in school and sports, but tonight it would change everything. He'd left his friend's house early, claiming a headache, but really wanting to finish a history project. As he approached his house at 11:30 p.m., he noticed his mother's car missing from the driveway. Strange. She'd gone to bed an hour before he left. Curiosity piqued. Kyle decided to wait in the shadows of their oak tree. 20 minutes later, Linda's Honda pulled into the driveway. But instead of heading straight inside, she sat in the car for several minutes, talking on her phone in hushed tones. When she finally emerged, Kyle noticed she was wearing different clothes than when he'd left, a detail that sent ice through his veins. Kyle slipped through the back door and up to his room, his mind racing. He'd suspected something was wrong for weeks, but this confirmed his worst fears. His mother was having an affair. Over the next few days, Kyle became a detective in his own home. He noticed how his mother's demeanor changed when Troy's name came up in conversation, how she volunteered to handle errands that took her past his neighborhood, how she developed a sudden interest in evening yoga classes that seemed to have no fixed schedule. The breakthrough came when Kyle discovered his mother had left her iPad unlocked while grading papers. A message notification popped up from T with a preview that made Kyle's stomach turn. "Can't wait to hold you again." Kyle took screenshots, his hands shaking with anger and disgust. How could she do this to Dad? To their family? His father worked tirelessly to protect people, to keep families safe, and his own wife was destroying theirs from within. But Kyle was his father's son in more ways than one. He didn't react impulsively. Instead, he planned. He needed concrete evidence, and he needed to protect his little sister from the fallout. Emma adored their mother, and Kyle couldn't bear the thought of her world being shattered by adult betrayals she couldn't understand. For 2 weeks, Kyle gathered evidence. He photographed his mother's changed behavior, documented the times she was supposedly at yoga but wasn't at the studio, and even followed her one evening to confirm what he already knew. Watching his mother embrace Troy in his driveway was the moment Kyle's heart truly broke, not just for his father, but for the family they'd all thought they were. The final piece came when Kyle overheard a phone conversation between his mother and Troy. They were planning a weekend getaway while Ray was scheduled to testify in court. The casual way they discussed deceiving his father, the laughter in their voices as they planned their betrayal, filled Kyle with a rage he'd never experienced. That night, Kyle made a decision that would haunt him forever. He had to tell his father. But not just tell him. He had to make sure his father was prepared for what was coming. Ray Morrison was a man who valued loyalty above all else, and Kyle knew that this betrayal would destroy him unless he was ready for it. Kyle spent hours crafting his approach. He compiled the evidence into a folder, wrote a letter explaining everything he'd discovered, and prepared for the most difficult conversation of his life. He knew that once he revealed this truth, there would be no going back. Their family would never be the same. As Kyle watched his parents interact over breakfast the next morning, his father reading Emma a story while his mother smiled and played the perfect wife, he felt a bitter taste in his mouth. The performance was flawless, but Kyle could see through it now. He saw the way his mother's eyes darted to her phone, the guilt she masked with overcompensating affection, the lies hidden behind her loving smile. Tonight, Kyle decided, he would give his father the evidence. And then he would let Ray Morrison, the detective, the protector, the man who never let criminals escape justice, decide what to do about the criminals living in his own home. Chapter 3: The Revelation. Ray Morrison was reviewing case files in his study when Kyle knocked on the door. Something in his son's demeanor immediately put Ray on alert, the same tension he'd learned to recognize in witnesses about to reveal crucial information. "Dad, we need to talk. It's important." Ray set aside his files, giving Kyle his full attention. What followed was the most devastating conversation of his life. Kyle laid out the evidence methodically, just as Ray had taught him through years of dinner-table discussions about police work. The screenshots, the photos, the timeline of deception, all presented with the cold precision of a case file. Ray's first instinct was denial. Not Linda. Not the woman who'd held him through nightmares after particularly brutal cases, who'd never complained about his long hours or the darkness he brought home. But Kyle's evidence was irrefutable, and Ray's detective instincts confirmed what his heart refused to accept. "How long have you known?" Ray's voice was eerily calm. 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Ray studied his 17-year-old son, seeing a maturity that no teenager should have to possess. Kyle had been forced to become an adult overnight, carrying the weight of a family secret that could destroy them all. "Your mother doesn't know that you know?" "No. And Emma?" "Emma stays protected," Ray finished. "Whatever happens, she doesn't get hurt by this." Over the next hour, Ray examined every piece of evidence Kyle had gathered. His son had been thorough, disturbingly so for someone so young. As Ray processed the betrayal, he felt something cold and calculating settle in his chest, replacing the initial shock and pain. Linda had been meeting Troy during Ray's court appearance next week. They planned it perfectly, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that Ray had been planning something too, a surprise weekend getaway for the family to celebrate closing his latest case. The irony wasn't lost on him. "What are you going to do?" Kyle asked, fear evident in his voice. He'd seen his father deal with criminals before, witnessed the controlled fury that made hardened gang members break down and confess. Ray was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother made her choice. Troy made his. Now they get to live with the consequences." "Dad, you're scaring me." Ray looked at his son, really looked at him. Kyle had been forced to grow up too fast, to see the ugly truth about the woman who'd raised him. The boy had tried to protect the family the only way he knew how, but now he was terrified of what he'd unleashed. "You did the right thing telling me," Ray said, his voice softer. "But from now on, you follow my lead. Can you do that?" Kyle nodded, though Ray could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Good. Now, here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow is Friday. Your mother thinks she's going to spend next weekend with Troy. Instead, she's going to discover that some people pay a much higher price for betrayal than others." Ray's mind was already working, formulating a plan that would make his wife and her lover understand exactly what they'd done and what it cost to betray Ray Morrison. He'd spent 15 years studying the criminal mind, learning how predators operated, understanding their weaknesses and fears. Linda and Troy had made the mistake of thinking Ray was just another trusting husband, blind to their deception. They were about to learn that Ray Morrison wasn't just any husband. He was a man who dedicated his life to making sure people faced consequences for their actions. And consequences, Ray decided, were exactly what they were going to get. As Kyle left the study, Ray opened his laptop and began typing. He had calls to make, favors to collect, and a plan to set in motion. By Monday morning, Linda and Troy would understand that some betrayals come with a price tag they could never have imagined. The detective in Ray Morrison was about to become something much more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and all the skills necessary to make sure justice was served. Chapter 4. Setting the Trap. Ray Morrison spent Friday night in his garage, a space that had always been his sanctuary. Surrounded by tools, workbenches, and memorabilia from his police career, he felt more like himself than he had in months. But tonight, he wasn't reminiscing, he was planning. Linda had left for her girls' weekend that morning, kissing him goodbye with such convincing affection that Ray almost admired her acting skills. Emma was spending the weekend with Linda's parents, a convenient arrangement that Linda had suggested herself. Perfect isolation for what Ray had in mind. Troy Hansen believed he was getting away with the perfect crime, seducing another man's wife while maintaining the facade of friendship. What Troy didn't realize was that Ray had been studying his patterns for months, long before he knew about the affair. As a detective, Ray made it his business to know his neighbors, and Troy's predictable habits would now work against him. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from his contact at the phone company, one of many favors he'd accumulated over the years. Linda and Troy's location data confirmed they were at the mountain cabin Troy owned, 3 hours away. They felt safe, isolated, untouchable. Kyle emerged from the house, his face pale but determined. "Dad, I keep thinking maybe we should just..." "Should just what?" Ray's voice was measured, dangerous. "Let them continue making fools of us. Let them destroy our family while they laugh about it. But what you're planning, it sounds like justice." Ray turned to face his son fully. "Kyle, I need you to understand something. In my work, I've seen what happens when people don't face consequences for their actions. They get bolder. They hurt more people. They never stop." Ray pulled out a photo from his wallet, a picture of a woman named Maria Santos, a victim from one of his early cases. Her husband had cheated, and when she tried to leave, he'd escalated to violence. Ray had been too late to save her. This woman died because someone thought they could betray, lie, and manipulate without consequences. I won't let that be Emma's future. I won't let your mother teach our daughter that betrayal is acceptable. Kyle swallowed hard, understanding the weight of his father's words. Ray's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Troy's real estate business was built on carefully maintained relationships and reputation. His divorce had cost him half his assets, and his business was still recovering. Ray had spent the week learning everything about Troy's financial situation, his business partnerships, his fears. "Tomorrow morning," Ray explained to Kyle, "Troy and your mother will return to find that their secret is no longer secret. But that's just the beginning." Ray had already contacted Troy's business partners with concerns about some irregularities he'd noticed as a neighbor. Anonymous tips to the IRS about potential unreported income. Whispered rumors to the Homeowners Association about noise complaints and property violations that would trigger investigations. But the psychological warfare was where Ray's true expertise lay. He'd learned from interrogating countless criminals that the mind was the most effective weapon. People could endure physical pain, but the constant fear of exposure, the paranoia of not knowing what would happen next, that broke them down completely. Your mother will come home Sunday evening expecting to slip back into her normal life, Ray continued. Instead, she'll find divorce papers and a meticulously documented file of every lie she's told, every secret meeting, every betrayal. She'll realize that while she thought she was being clever, I was being thorough. Kyle shifted uncomfortably. And then she gets to explain to Emma why Mommy has to move out. She gets to live with the consequences of her choices. Ray's voice carried no emotion, but Kyle could see the pain beneath his father's controlled exterior. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about a man trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his faith in humanity. What about Troy? Ray's smile was cold enough to make Kyle step back. Troy's about to discover that destroying a police detective's family isn't just morally wrong. It's strategically stupid. He's going to learn that I have friends in many different departments, and those friends don't appreciate civilians who prey on law enforcement families. As Ray outlined the rest of his plan, Kyle began to understand the depth of his father's capabilities. This wasn't impulsive revenge. It was systematic destruction, carried out with the same methodical precision Ray brought to his most complex cases. By Monday morning, Troy and Linda would wake up to a world where their secret affair was the least of their problems. They'd face financial ruin, social disgrace, and the constant uncertainty of not knowing what Ray would do next. And the beautiful part, Ray realized, was that it was all perfectly legal. Every action he'd taken could be justified. Every consequence could be traced back to their own choices. He wasn't becoming a criminal. He was simply ensuring that criminals faced appropriate justice. Chapter 5. The night everything changed. Sunday evening arrived with the weight of an approaching storm. Ray had spent the weekend fine-tuning his preparations, while Kyle struggled with the knowledge of what was coming. The house felt different, charged with the electricity of secrets and impending confrontation. At 9:17 p.m., Linda's headlights swept across the driveway. Ray watched from the living room window as she sat in her car for several minutes, probably texting Troy one last goodbye before returning to her normal life. The casual cruelty of her deception struck Ray anew. How easily she could compartmentalize her betrayal. Linda entered through the front door, calling out cheerfully, "Ray, I'm home. How was your weekend with the kids?" "Emma's at your parents'," Ray replied calmly from the living room. "Kyle's upstairs. We need to talk." Something in his tone made Linda pause. Ray watched as her face shifted from casual happiness to wariness, the same expression he'd seen on suspects who suddenly realized their alibis had fallen apart. "Is everything okay?" she asked, moving toward him slowly. "Sit down, Linda." The envelope sat on the coffee table between them like a loaded weapon. Ray had debated how to handle this moment, but ultimately decided that directness served his purposes better than theatrical reveals. "I know about Troy." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. Ray watched as color drained from her face, as her hands began to tremble. For 15 years, he'd prided himself on reading people, but seeing his wife's guilt and fear so nakedly displayed felt like a twisted victory. "Ray, I don't know what you think. I know about the cabin. I know about the phone calls. I know about every lie you've told me for the past 6 months." Ray's voice remained steady, professional. "The question now is whether you're going to continue lying or start dealing with reality." Linda's composure cracked completely. Tears began flowing as she realized the magnitude of her exposure. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." The envelope contained everything: photos, phone records, a timeline of their affair that was more detailed than anything Linda could have imagined. As she flipped through the evidence, Ray watched her understand that this wasn't an angry husband's suspicion. This was a detective's case file. "Kyle?" she whispered, seeing some of the evidence could only have come from their son. "Kyle tried to protect this family, which is more than I can say for you." Linda's sobs filled the room, but Ray felt no satisfaction. This was necessary surgery, painful but essential to save what could still be saved. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "Ray, I'm so sorry. It just happened, and then I couldn't stop, and—" "Stop." Ray's command cut through her rambling. "You made choices. Every text, every meeting, every lie. Those were choices. Now you get to live with the consequences." He slid the divorce papers across the table. Linda stared at them as if they were written in a foreign language. "You have until tomorrow morning to pack your essentials. The rest can be sorted through lawyers." "Ray, please. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can." "No, we can't." Ray's finality was absolute. You betrayed our marriage, our family, our daughter's future. You chose Troy over us. Now you get to live with that choice. Linda's pleas became desperate, frantic. She spoke of mistakes, of confusion, of how much she loved their family. But Ray had heard similar pleas from countless criminals trying to escape the consequences of their actions. The words meant nothing now. What about Emma? Linda's voice broke completely. Emma will be told that Mommy made choices that hurt our family, and now she has to live somewhere else. You'll have supervised visitation until we can determine if you're capable of putting our daughter's well-being before your own desires. The cruelty of Ray's words was intentional. Linda needed to understand that her actions had consequences beyond her own happiness, that her betrayal had created ripples that would affect their daughter for years to come. As Linda sobbed at the table, Ray felt Kyle's presence upstairs, his son probably listening to every word, learning harsh lessons about trust and consequences. Ray hated that Kyle had to witness this, but perhaps it was better that he understood early how quickly people could betray those who trusted them most. At 11:43 p.m., Ray's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your wife's car is in my driveway. We need to talk. Troy. Ray almost smiled. The fool actually thought he could negotiate, as if this was a business deal rather than the destruction of two lives that had been built on lies. Ray typed back, come over. Let's talk. It was time for the second act of the evening. Troy Hansen was about to learn that seducing another man's wife was only the beginning of his problems. Chapter 6. Face to face with the enemy. 20 minutes later, Troy's BMW pulled into the driveway. Ray watched through the window as his neighbor, former friend, current enemy, sat in his car for several minutes, probably trying to decide on his approach. Strategic thinking, but far too late to matter. Troy knocked on the front door with the confidence of a man who'd convinced himself he could charm his way out of any situation. Ray had seen that same misplaced confidence in countless criminals who believed their intelligence made them untouchable. Ray, Troy said as the door opened, extending his hand in a gesture that reeked of false normalcy. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Ray didn't take the hand. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing Troy to enter. Linda was still at the kitchen table, her face streaked with tears, the divorce papers scattered before her like evidence of her shattered life. Linda. Troy's voice carried genuine concern, and Ray realized the man actually believed he cared about her. The delusion was almost admirable. Sit down, Troy, Ray commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement. Troy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the power dynamic, but eventually took a seat across from Linda. Ray remained standing, a deliberate choice that kept him in the dominant position. Let's establish some facts, Ray began, his tone clinical. You've been sleeping with my wife for 6 months. You've been lying to my face while eating dinner at my table. You've been using your position as my neighbor and friend to betray my family. Troy's jaw tightened. Ray, I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, Troy. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that I misjudged your character so completely. I'm disappointed that I trusted you around my children. But angry? No. Anger is an emotion, and emotions cloud judgment. The calm delivery was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. Troy shifted uncomfortably, realizing he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than an enraged husband. What do you want? Troy asked, cutting through Ray's psychological warfare. I want you to understand the consequences of your choices. Ray moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew another envelope. This contains documentation of every building code violation on your property, every tax discrepancy in your business records, every instance where you've bent rules to make deals happen. Troy's face went pale. You've been investigating me? I've been doing my job. You see, when someone threatens my family, I make it my business to know everything about them. And you, Troy, have been very careless. Ray spread the contents of the envelope across the table. Building permits that didn't match actual construction, business expenses that looked suspiciously like personal purchases, property dealings that skirted ethical boundaries without quite crossing legal lines. None of this is illegal, Troy said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, but it's enough to trigger investigations. IRS audits take years and cost tens of thousands in legal fees. Building code violations result in expensive retrofits. Business partners get nervous when questions are raised about their associates' practices. Ray watched as understanding dawned in Troy's eyes. This wasn't about a cuckolded husband seeking revenge. This was about systematic destruction carried out by someone with the resources and knowledge to make it devastating. Your mortgage is already leveraged to the limit, Ray continued. Your business loan has a morality clause that allows the bank to call it in if your reputation is damaged. Your ex-wife's alimony agreement includes provisions for increased payments if your income rises, which means she'll be very interested in auditing your actual earnings. Troy's hands began to shake. You can't do this. I'm not doing anything. I'm simply ensuring that the proper authorities are aware of potential irregularities. What they choose to investigate is entirely up to them. Linda watched the exchange with growing horror, finally understanding that Ray's revenge wouldn't be quick or clean. It would be thorough, methodical, and completely legal. What do you want? Troy repeated, his earlier confidence completely gone. I want you to disappear, Ray said simply. I want you to sell your house, leave town, and never contact my family again. I want you to understand that if you ever come near my wife or my children, the consequences will be far worse than financial ruin. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Troy looked at Linda, perhaps hoping for support, but found only a woman drowning in the consequences of her own choices. And if I don't? Ray's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. Then you'll discover that 15 years of police work has given me a very particular set of skills and connections. You'll learn that crossing a law enforcement officer isn't just stupid, it's suicidal. Troy stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is extortion. No, Ray corrected. Extortion would be if I demanded money or favors in exchange for my silence. I'm simply informing you of the natural consequences of your actions. What happens next is entirely your choice. As Troy moved toward the door, Linda called out desperately, Troy, wait. Don't leave me. Both men turned to look at her, and Ray saw something break in Troy's face. The final realization that his romantic fantasy had become a nightmare with real-world consequences. I'm sorry, Linda, Troy said quietly. I never meant for this to happen. After Troy left, the house fell into a heavy silence. Linda continued crying at the table while Ray stood by the window, watching his neighbor's house. Upstairs, Kyle's door closed softly. Their son had heard everything. Ray felt no satisfaction in Troy's defeat or Linda's despair. This wasn't about victory. It was about ensuring that people faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, rebuilding a life from the ashes of betrayal and teaching his children that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Chapter 7. Consequences Unfold. Monday morning brought the illusion of normalcy. Coffee brewing, news on television, the sounds of a suburban neighborhood waking up. But inside the Morrison house, everything had changed. Linda had spent the night packing, her movements mechanical and defeated. Ray had slept in his study, not trusting himself to share the same space with a woman who now felt like a stranger. Kyle had left early for school, unable to face the wreckage of their family breakfast table. Before leaving, he knocked on Ray's study door. Dad, are you okay? I will be, Ray had answered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. By 10 a.m., Ray's phone was buzzing with calls. The first came from Troy's business partner, expressing concerns about some irregularities that had been brought to his attention. The second was from a building inspector who needed to schedule a surprise inspection of Troy's properties. The third was from Troy himself. You bastard. Troy's voice was shaking with rage. My bank is calling my loan. The IRS wants to audit 3 years of returns. What did you do? I told you there would be consequences, Ray replied calmly. You chose not to believe me. This is insane. You're destroying my life over an affair. No, Troy. You destroyed your life when you decided to betray a friend and break up a family. I'm just making sure you understand the full cost of that decision. Ray hung up and poured himself another cup of coffee. His phone immediately rang again, Linda calling from her car. Ray, please. I've been thinking all night. We can fix this. I'll never see Troy again. I'll do anything. Linda, I want you to listen carefully, Ray interrupted. I'm going to pick up Emma from your parents' house this afternoon. I'm going to explain to our 5-year-old daughter that Mommy has decided to live somewhere else for a while. Do you understand what that means? Ray, don't. I'm going to watch our baby girl's heart break because her mother chose to betray our family. I'm going to hold her while she cries and asks why Mommy doesn't love us anymore. And then I'm going to spend the next 10 years helping her understand that sometimes people we love make choices that hurt us. Linda's sobs came through the phone, but Ray felt no sympathy. You did this, Linda. Every tear Emma sheds. Every night, she goes to bed wondering why her family fell apart. That's on you. The call ended with Linda's broken promises echoing in empty air. Ray spent the morning making additional calls. To his captain, requesting emergency leave to handle a family crisis. To his lawyer, scheduling a meeting to discuss custody arrangements. To a counselor who specialized in helping children cope with divorce. Each call was necessary, methodical, part of the process of rebuilding a life that Linda had shattered with her choices. At 2 p.m., Ray's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Kyle standing there, having skipped his afternoon classes. Everyone at school knows, Kyle said quietly. Some kid's mom saw the police cars at Troy's house this morning. They were asking about business stuff, but word got around. Ray nodded. The social consequences were beginning, just as he'd planned. In a community where reputation mattered, where business was built on trust and relationships, being investigated by multiple agencies was social and economic death. How do you feel about that? Ray asked his son. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. I feel like justice is happening, but I also feel sick that it had to happen at all. That's the difference between you and your mother, Ray said. You understand that actions have consequences. She thought she could betray our family without paying a price. Kyle sat down heavily on the front steps. Dad, what's going to happen to us? We're going to survive. We're going to take care of Emma. We're going to learn that family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty and trust. And we're going to make sure no one ever takes advantage of us again. As they talked, a moving truck appeared in front of Troy's house. Ray watched with grim satisfaction as Troy directed movers to load his belongings. The for sale sign had gone up that morning. Apparently, Troy had decided that Ray's consequences were more than he was willing to endure. Is he really leaving? Kyle asked. Smart move on his part, Ray replied. If he'd stayed, things would have gotten much worse. Kyle looked at his father with a mixture of respect and fear. Dad, sometimes you scare me. Good, Ray said simply. Fear keeps you honest. Fear makes you think twice before you betray people who trust you. Your mother and Troy forgot to be afraid of consequences. That was their mistake. As the moving truck pulled away, Ray felt a chapter closing. Troy was gone, Linda was packing, and tomorrow he would begin the process of rebuilding his family from the ashes of betrayal. But the lesson had been learned, Ray realized. Kyle would never trust blindly again. Emma would grow up understanding that love meant loyalty. And Ray himself had been reminded that in a world full of predators, sometimes the only way to protect your family was to become something more dangerous than the threats you faced. The consequences were still unfolding, but Ray Morrison had proven his point. Some people learned from their mistakes, and others simply learned to fear the cost of making them. Chapter 8. The Price of Betrayal. 2 weeks later, the full scope of Ray's methodical revenge had become clear. Troy's real estate business had collapsed under the weight of multiple investigations, client concerns, and partnership dissolutions. The IRS audit had revealed enough irregularities to result in substantial penalties and liens against his properties. His ex-wife's lawyer had successfully argued for increased alimony based on previously unreported income. Most devastating of all, Troy's reputation in the community had been thoroughly destroyed. In a business built on trust and relationships, being under investigation by multiple agencies was professional suicide. Former clients had pulled their listings, potential buyers had walked away from deals, and his business partners had dissolved their agreements to protect their own reputations. Ray tracked Troy's destruction with the same methodical precision he brought to his police cases. It wasn't enough to simply punish the man. Ray needed to ensure that Troy understood the full consequences of betraying a family, that he would never again make the mistake of thinking he could destroy other people's lives without facing severe repercussions. Linda had moved into a small apartment across town. Her teacher's salary barely covering her new expenses after Ray's lawyer had negotiated a separation agreement that heavily favored the wronged party. She called daily, begging for another chance, promising that she'd learned her lesson and would never betray the family again. Ray's response was always the same. You made your choice, Linda. Now live with the consequences. Emma had taken the separation harder than Kyle, crying herself to sleep for the first week and asking repeatedly when Mommy would come home. Ray had held his daughter through her tears, hating Linda more with each sob for the pain she'd caused their innocent child. But Emma was resilient in the way only children could be, and gradually she began adapting to their new reality. Ray had arranged for a counselor to help her process the divorce, carefully screening the therapist to ensure Emma received support without being exposed to concepts of betrayal and infidelity that were too adult for her to understand. Kyle had grown up considerably in the past month, taking on more responsibility around the house and stepping into a protective role with his younger sister. Ray was proud of his son's maturity, but saddened that Kyle had been forced to grow up so quickly. "Dad," Kyle said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, "do you think Mom really understands what she did?" Ray considered the question carefully. "I think your mother understands that she got caught and that there were consequences. Whether she truly understands that she betrayed our family's trust and damaged her own daughter's sense of security, I'm not sure she's capable of that level of self-awareness." Kyle nodded, processing his father's words. "Will you ever forgive her?" "No," Ray said without hesitation. "Forgiveness requires genuine remorse and changed behavior. Your mother is sorry she got caught, but I don't believe she's truly sorry for what she did. And even if she were, some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive." That evening, Ray received a call from a detective in a neighboring jurisdiction. Troy had been arrested for harassment after repeatedly calling Linda and threatening her with violence, blaming her for ruining his life with their affair. The irony wasn't lost on Ray. Troy had finally shown his true character, proving that he was exactly the kind of man who would blame others for the consequences of his own choices. Linda had called Ray in tears after Troy's arrest, seeking comfort from the husband she'd betrayed. Ray had listened to her fears and panic with clinical detachment before offering a simple response. "You chose to get involved with a man you didn't really know. This is what that choice looks like." Kyle had overheard the conversation and asked his father later if he felt bad for his mother's fear. "I feel bad for the woman I thought I married," Ray replied. "But that woman never really existed. The real Linda made choices that put our family at risk and then acted surprised when those choices had consequences. I can't feel sorry for someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own actions." As the weeks passed, Ray began to see the long-term effects of his systematic destruction of Troy and Linda's lives. Troy had been forced to declare bankruptcy and move to another state, his reputation so thoroughly ruined that he couldn't find work in real estate anywhere in Colorado. Linda's social circle had gradually distanced themselves from her as word of the affair spread, leaving her isolated and struggling to rebuild her life. Ray felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only a cold sense of justice served. He had proven that betraying his family came with consequences that would last for years, perhaps decades. More importantly, he had demonstrated to Kyle and Emma that loyalty mattered, that trust was sacred, and that some lines could never be crossed without permanent consequences. The lesson had been brutal but necessary. In Ray Morrison's world, betrayal was met with destruction, and mercy was reserved for those who earned it through genuine loyalty and trust. Chapter 9. The New Order. 6 months after the night Kyle revealed his mother's betrayal, the Morrison family had found its new rhythm. Ray had taken early retirement from the police force, using his accumulated savings and Linda's forfeit of community property to ensure financial stability while he focused on raising his children. Emma, now 6, had adapted to the custody arrangement with the resilience that had always characterized her personality. She spent every other weekend with Linda under supervised visitation, but had begun expressing reluctance to go even for those limited visits. Linda's apartment was small and depressing, and her attempts to overcompensate for her absence with gifts and permissive parenting only confused Emma more. "Daddy," Emma had said the previous weekend, "why does Mommy cry so much when I visit her?" Ray had knelt to his daughter's level, choosing his words carefully. "Because Mommy made choices that hurt our family, and now she has to live with those choices. Sometimes people cry when they realize they can't undo their mistakes." Kyle was thriving in his senior year, having been accepted to several colleges with strong criminal justice programs. The events of the past months had solidified his decision to follow his father into law enforcement, though he developed a much more cynical view of human nature. "I've been thinking about what happened with Mom and Troy," Kyle said one evening as he and Ray worked on college applications. "And I realized something. They both thought they were smarter than everyone else. They thought they could lie and manipulate without consequences. What did you learn from that? Ray asked. That the most dangerous people are often the ones who think they're too clever to get caught. And that trust, once broken, can never really be repaired. Ray nodded approvingly. His son had learned harsh but valuable lessons about human nature and the importance of loyalty. Linda's attempts at reconciliation had become increasingly desperate as she realized that Ray's rejection was permanent. She'd tried everything from romantic gestures to legal threats, but Ray's position never wavered. She had made her choice, and he had made his. She wants to come to Emma's birthday party, Kyle reported after one of Linda's calls. No, Ray said firmly. Emma's birthday will be celebrated by people who put her well-being first. Your mother forfeited the right to participate in family celebrations when she chose to destroy our family. The cruelty of excluding Linda from their daughter's birthday was intentional. Ray wanted her to understand that betrayal had permanent consequences, that some choices couldn't be undone with apologies or time. Troy had disappeared entirely after his bankruptcy and arrest, reportedly moving to another state where his past wouldn't follow him. Ray occasionally checked to ensure he hadn't returned, but was satisfied that the man had learned his lesson about the cost of betraying the wrong family. Ray's reputation in the community had actually been enhanced by his handling of the situation. Word had spread about how he'd systematically destroyed his wife's lover without breaking any laws, earning him respect from neighbors who saw him as a man who protected his family with intelligence and determination rather than violence. You know what I learned from all this? Ray told Kyle one evening as they watched Emma play in the backyard. I learned that being a good person doesn't mean being a weak person. Sometimes protecting the people you love requires being absolutely ruthless with the people who threaten them. Kyle nodded, understanding the distinction. His father hadn't become a villain. He'd simply demonstrated that loyalty and trust were sacred, and that violating them came with consequences that could last a lifetime. As Emma's laughter carried across the yard, Ray felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since before Linda's betrayal. His family was smaller now, but it was stronger. Kyle and Emma would grow up understanding that love meant loyalty, that trust was precious, and that some people earned forgiveness while others earned only the consequences of their choices. Ray Morrison had lost a wife and gained clarity about what truly mattered. He'd taught his children that betrayal was met with destruction, that mercy was earned rather than given, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to forgive someone who had proven they couldn't be trusted. The foundation of their new life was built on harder truths than before, but Ray knew it would never crack the way their old life had. Because now, everyone understood the price of betrayal and the value of the loyalty that remained. In Ray Morrison's world, there were people who earned trust and people who earned consequences. Linda and Troy had chosen their category, and now they would live with that choice forever. Some lessons, Ray had learned, were worth teaching no matter how much they cost.